Hey class, this week we're going to be talking about chapter 13 from the textbook and delving into sociological topics that relate to the aging process and the elderly population in our societies. Different societies and cultures interpret the aging process in very different ways. The term, quote, old is a socially defined concept. So every culture has its own set of expectations and assumptions about aging, and these ideas and interpretations are a product of our socialization. In Western cultures, for example, many media portrayals of the elderly reflect kind of negative cultural attitudes toward aging and elderly people. For example, the characters up here in the upper left, their names are Statler and Waldorf, and they're the two grumpy old men who sit in the balcony and heckle the Muppets. Another example is the senile and rambling Grandpa Simpson from The Simpsons. And most media portrayals present the elderly as an object of humor, to be laughed at, or not to be taken seriously, as they're simply just old, disgruntled, and angry. And in the United States, our society tends to glorify youthfulness and associates youth with beauty and sexuality. So the people who have, quote, lost their youth become kind of viewed as unappealing. The anti-aging market, of course, is big business in America. We see pills for stamina, supplements, anti-wrinkle creams, rejuvenation surgeries, and so on. Signs of natural aging in the United States in our society often causes shame or embarrassment to the people who are growing older, maybe getting wrinkles on their face. And this happens because in our society, we've been socialized to believe that growing old equates to a loss of your vitality. So the elderly can often be relegated to feelings of being invisible or devalued. And when we think about life stages, the aging process stands apart, as most people don't really understand this stage of elderly life until we actually reach it. Unlike childhood, we all have experienced it and can look back on it. But people rarely understand the process of aging until it's happening to them. And because of this, many stereotypes exist about the process of aging and the realities of being an older adult. So scholars and sociologists that study the aging process and the elderly learn that aging reflects not only these physical changes that come with growing old, but also the social attitudes and beliefs about the aging process. So below are several important terms just to familiarize ourselves with before we delve deeper into kind of all of these social issues associated with aging. So first we have the term senescence, and this refers to the aging process, including biological, emotional, intellectual, social, and spiritual changes. The next term is gerontology, and this is the field of science that seeks to understand the process of aging and the challenges encountered as seniors grow older. And then a subfield of gerontology is social gerontology. So that's a specialized field of gerontology that examines the social and sociological aspects of aging. So they would focus on specific issues such as the process of dying, the mental and physical well-being of adults of specific elderly age groups, Or researchers in this field claim that cultural attitudes toward the elderly have been affected greatly by industrialization and modernization, thus lowering the power, influence, and prestige of old age that was once much more prevalent in other times in history. Then we have two different categories of elderly down here. We have centenarians. These are people who live to be 100 years old. Estimates show that there's about 30,000 to 45,000 centenarians around the world. And then we have the super centenarians, who are people who live to 110 years old or older. And there's about 300 to 450 super centenarians around the world. Now, the U.S. Census Bureau has been tracking age in the population since 1790. In the United States, the median age of the population is 40 years old, meaning half the population is under 40 and the other half is over 40. But this median age has been increasing steadily with each census collected. In other words, the U.S. population as a whole is growing older. And that is demonstrated here in this graphic that I have included on the bottom right of this slide. And you can see in 1900, the elderly, here classified as 65 years and older. In 1900, the elderly population was about 3.5% of the total population. And flash forward to 2010, the elderly population is a little over 12% of the population. Now, this year we have the 2020 census being completed, so next, probably very early next year, we'll see a new graphic that will show kind of this growth in 2020 from 2010, and estimates show that it's around 14 to 16% now. So the United States government defines old age as 65 years of age and older, the point at which older adults are eligible for Social Security and Medicare. But the AARP, the American Association for Retired Persons membership, requires you to be age 50 or older to be considered old. The U.S. population, again, is getting old as a whole. One explanation for this lies with changes in life expectancy due to advances in medicine. And of course, life expectancy refers to the average number of years a person born today might expect to live. Today, elderly individuals, and I'm talking about 65 years and older, account for 15% of the total U.S. population. Current projections show that by 2030, the U.S. elderly population is going to almost double, with about 90 million older adults. Now, men and women in the United States do not age equally. You've probably heard this before, but women have longer life expectancies than men, and this has been true since 1950. So women generally live about 4 to 5 years longer than men do. As you can see on this chart, the blue bars represent females and the red represent males. So you can see women generally living about 4 to 5 years longer than men since 1950. So why are we experiencing this graying of the United States, or this revelation that the United States population is getting older as a whole? Most people point to the baby boomer population that was born between 1946 and 1964 to account for this kind of burst in elderly population that we're experiencing now. So growing up in the 1960s and the 1970s, the baby boom generation was the first group of children and teenagers to have significant spending power and marketing power in the United States. The baby boomer group has redefined what it means to be young, middle-aged, and old as they have gone through this aging process. And they don't want to grow up like their grandparents did. There's a wide range of products that cater specifically to this age cohort, designed to guard against the effects and signs of aging. And the baby boom generation is driving much of the dramatic increase in this 65 plus age population. Now, healthcare is a critical area that's affected by the aging of the baby boomer cohort. The growing elderly population brings increased costs for Medicare, and current estimates show that Medicare spending is expected to increase from 3% of our GDP in 2009 to 8% in 2030, and 15% of our GDP by 2080. A study from 2008 showed that medical schools are not producing enough medical professionals who specialize in treating elderly patients. On the other hand, the rise in the geriatric population brings a boon to some healthcare industries, such as pharmaceutical companies and home healthcare service businesses. Baby boomers want to age gracefully and continue to live active lives, and this desire to continue being vital into old age requires more medical support, and some argue that this is driving innovation in the medical industry. Now, the economic impact of aging boomers is of concern also. Although the baby boomers enjoyed a higher standard of living than previous generations, they also spent money more lavishly, and many did not really plan adequately for their retirement. A 2008 study found that 2/3 of the baby boomer population have not saved enough for a retirement in which they could maintain their lifestyles. And this will have a ripple effect on the economy as this cohort begins to work and spend less. Social Security is another issue and is considered at risk alongside Medicare. Some economists warn that Social Security could collapse by the year 2037 because fewer workers will be paying in and more retirees will be taking money out. For instance, if we look at this graphic up here on the right, in 1960, there were about 5 people in the workforce, in the working population, paying into Social Security for every 1 beneficiary. But by 2030, the projection is that there will be about 2 people in the working population paying into Social Security for every 1 beneficiary. In other words, fewer people will be paying into the Social Security fund at the same time that the aging and retired population will be growing rapidly. So some suggest the retirement age should be raised to 70 in order to curb that current threat to Social Security. In 1950, the government paid $781 million to Social Security. Today, the payments are 870 times higher, and 28% of all tax dollars is spent on either Social Security or Medicaid. Now, this growth in the elderly population is not just happening in the United States, it's also growing on a global scale. Today, the global elderly population makes up about 13% of the total population. But by 2050, the global elderly population will make up about 21.5% of the global population. One country that's facing a very serious aging crisis is China. Chinese citizens over 60 make up about 13.3% of the total Chinese population. But by 2050, this cohort will increase to over 30% of the total Chinese population. Globally, core nations are much more prepared to take on the demands of the growing elderly population. The years to come could bring a global crisis of elderly people living in poverty. Now, Eastern cultures have a pretty different perspective on aging and the elderly than we're used to in the West, due to kind of their belief in Confucian ideals, and Confucianism was a very early religion in Asian cultures, and a major focal point of Confucianism is to respect your elders and to learn from them and to take care of them. So in many Asian cultures, the responsibility for elder care lies firmly on the family, and this is due to a deeply ingrained belief and practice that comes from Confucianism that's called filial piety. Filial basically just means family, so which is deference and respect to one's parents and ancestors. For example, in our country, it's pretty common to send older adults to nursing homes or retirement communities, but the practice of filial piety in Asian countries kind of interprets this as shameful and not indicative of the veneration for the wisdom of the elderly that they deserve. So on top of this slide, I have a link if you would like to watch it. It's just a video that talks about human rights and the elderly around the world. And it looks at older people in every part of the world and claims that the elderly are routinely denied human rights. The video provides examples of health, freedom from violence, abuse and neglect, support and assistance, social security, and protection and security in humanitarian settings. And this video illustrates how the current international human rights situation is failing older people. Now, one important assembly when we're talking about aging to pay attention to is referred to as the Madrid Plan. And the Madrid Plan in 2002 was an internationally coordinated effort to create comprehensive social policies to address the needs of the worldwide aging population. This plan aimed to raise consciousness to factors influencing the vulnerability of the elderly population, like social exclusion, prejudice and discrimination, and lack of socio-legal protections. The plan links these issues with larger development issues such as human rights and empowerment. And they offered 3 themes to guide international policy on aging for the first half of the 21st century. Number 1 is public acknowledgement of the global challenges caused by and the opportunities created by a rising global population. Number 2 is empowering the elderly. And 3 is linking international policies on aging to international policies on development. So sociologists often utilize the discourse of the, quote, life course when studying aging. And the life course refers to the period from birth to death and includes a sequence of kind of predictable life stages and life events, such as physical maturation. Each phase comes with different responsibilities and expectations, which vary by individual and by culture. The stages of the life course are infancy, childhood, preteen, your teenage years, your young adult years, grow into an adult, move into middle age and the empty nest, and then you transition into old age. So through the phases of this life course, your levels of dependence and independence change. So we start very, very dependent as a young child, an infant. We grow toward independence, and as we get older, we become more and more dependent on others again. In most cultures, age is a master status, influencing self-concept as well as social roles and interactions. A master status is just something within a certain specific society. When you look at someone, we kind of, especially in America, judge people based on their appearance and what they look like, what race they are, what gender they are, but especially how old the person is. So age, much like our class, our gender, our race, becomes this kind of hierarchy in which some categories are more highly valued than others. Now, primary aging and secondary aging. So primary aging refers to these biological factors such as molecular and cellular changes, things that really can't be avoided. They're going to happen when you're growing older. It's a biological fact of life. Then we have secondary aging, which refers to more controllable factors that have more to do with our activities and our habits, such as a lack of physical exercise or a poor diet. So most people begin to see signs of aging by age 50, like skin wrinkles, your hair starts turning gray, you might start losing your hair, or experiencing a decline in energy, more food sensitivities, not being able to eat a big juicy burger like you used to, or loss of hearing or vision. So the most frequently reported health issues for people over 65 are arthritis, hypertension, heart disease, and cancer. While there's a trend towards steady improvement in most disability measures for elderly Americans, there is a concomitant increase in functional impairments and chronic diseases. Medical advancements have reduced some of the worst effects of many diseases and disabilities associated with aging. Now the social and psychological changes. First, we'll start with retirement, which is when you withdraw from paid work at a certain age. The concept of retirement is a pretty recent idea, as for most of human history, people didn't really live as long as we're living today. Up until the 20th century, people worked about 60 hours a week, pretty much until they were physically incapable of continuing to work. In the 21st century, most people hope that at some point they'll be able to stop working, go relax, and enjoy the fruits of their labor during their elderly years. After retiring, many elderly people find new groups and explore new activities, but others might find it more difficult to adapt to new routines and this kind of loss of their previous social roles, which they could interpret as having lost kind of a sense of their self-worth during that aging process. And especially in capitalist societies where what we do and how we make money defines much of our lives, retired adults have to navigate how to contribute to society and feel that they're living fulfilling lives despite being outside of this labor market and the workforce. So remember, a couple slides back, we talked about those life stages, from infancy to childhood, preteen, teenager, young adult, adult, middle age, and old age. So the sociologist Erik Erikson kind of looked at these 8 different life stages and claimed that each of these life stages comes with its own set of challenges to face and overcome. We're not going to focus on the first 7, but we're going to focus today on particularly what he says about that last stage of old age. So the primary challenge Erikson identified during this life phase of old age is to embrace integrity over despair. So that's kind of the challenge that elderly are facing, is kind of, do I face this life period with kind of gusto and try to, redefine myself and continue to grow as a person, or do I linger in despair over these, my lost identity as a worker, as a caretaker, etc. So some people are not really able to face this challenge and they linger in despair. They may confront regrets or disappointments. They might just not really know how to adapt to this new phase. However, many others are able to embrace integrity and face this new phase in their life with energy and creativity. They start learning new skills, participating in new hobbies, spending time with their loved ones, and peacefully preparing for the end of their life and the legacy that they will leave behind. So on this slide, I have a link down here. It's an interview with Erik Erikson's wife after Erik had passed away. Her name is Joan Erikson, and she worked and collaborated with Erik quite a bit on his research and writings. So this interview, Joan Erikson is 90 years old. So she's certainly speaking about the aging process with her own experience of being a 90-year-old woman. So in this video, one quote that Joan Erikson says is, "Wisdom and integrity are something that other people may see in an old person, but it's not what that old person is feeling. That's what kind of roused me up to see what it was that old people do and what they have to face." And with that quote, Joan Erikson begins a frank and personal re-examination of the last stage of the life cycle. She and her husband, Erik Erikson, formulated this 8-stage life cycle theory during their middle-age years, and Mrs. Erikson believes they tended to romanticize the 8th stage in which she's now living. So this video clip was shot in 1993 when Mrs. Erikson was about to celebrate her 90th birthday, and she has a lot of grace, humor, and feistiness, and Miss Erikson takes on a wide range of topics from forgetfulness, coping with physical limitations, and facing death. This film is a thought-provoking experience for everyone interested in this process of aging and for all who live or work with older people. Now, newsflash, our sexual selves do not disappear after age 65. And studies show that 2/3 of elderly adults claim they are satisfied with their sex lives. So up here I've got a link to another little video. Again, you can find all of these videos also on Blackboard under the Chapter 13 content folder. But this video, it's entitled Sex, Love, and Intimacy in Later Life. And this video is about basically human sexuality as a universal part of living. But these stereotypes of older adults commonly ignore the importance of sexuality to them and the question of how important sexual activity and fulfillment is to older people with respect to their overall health and well-being continues to be neglected. Population-based surveys have shown that while many older people over 50 remain sexually active, sexual health remains a concern for men and women beyond their reproductive years. A wide range of physical and psychological health conditions, the drugs used to treat them, and chronic disability can adversely affect sexual activity and satisfaction. So from the perspective of successful aging, an important question is the manner in which transitions in health and sexuality intersect in later life to influence how individuals and couples flourish both physically and mentally. So basically, they're saying that the elderly, and especially sexual activity among the elderly, is very often kind of relegated to the corners of our minds. We don't think about it. And we don't really like to talk about it because of our kind of socialization into kind of glorifying the culture of youth and beauty. But it is an important topic to discuss and think about because people don't stop having sex when they're old. When you're 65, it's not as if you say, oh, I guess never be having sex again. It continues to happen. It happens all over nursing homes and retirement communities across the country. But this is important because if elderly sexual activity is being neglected, you're also neglecting all sorts of other issues that might be tied to this behavior. One example is that as many as 1 in 5 new cases of AIDS occurs in adults over 65 years old. So 20% of the new AIDS cases every year are occurring in our elderly population. And that's usually because, well, you're older, you're probably past your childbearing years, and so a lot of older people don't really worry about wearing protection or kind of guarding against STDs anymore because maybe they don't, since they think that they can't have babies anymore, there's no more need for protection. However, this statistic obviously proves otherwise. So that fear of unwanted pregnancy, again, is no longer an issue. They can't probably pass their childbearing years. Their children are grown and taking care of themselves. So protected sex becomes less and less prevalent with old age. In addition, a lot of drugs that have come out in the past 40 years or so that address sexual dysfunction have allowed for increased sexual activity among elderly people. And another issue that's only going to become more prevalent in the coming years is the LGBTQ community of the elderly. And that community is expected to double by 2030. And that doesn't necessarily mean that there's more LGBTQ individuals, but also that society is becoming more accepting of different sexual orientations and gender identities, and so elderly people might be more open about that identity and share it with others. LGBT elders have higher rates of disability and depression, and they're less likely to have a support system to provide elder care because they may not have ever had children, or may not ever have been able to get married to the person that they loved due to laws during the time that they were in their early adulthood or middle adulthood. So they don't have that support system that a lot of us count on when we move into our elderly years. They also face this added burden of, quote, disclosure management as they enter into assisted living facilities, with only 22% of LGBT elders reporting that they're comfortable disclosing their sexual orientation or gender identity to their long-term care facility because they're fearful of discrimination. Now, of course, one major kind of issue that elderly and all of us confront and think about is this ultimate reality for all of us that we will all eventually die one day. So we'll be talking about kind of the sociological perspective on death and dying over the next few slides here. So we'll start with a definition of grief. So grief is a psychological, emotional, and social response to the feeling of loss that accompanies death or a similar event. People tend to perceive death, their own and that of others, based on the values of their culture. Viewing death as a loss rather than a natural or a tranquil transition is usually considered normal in the United States. Now, not every culture views death as a loss. Some cultures, they celebrate deaths because the person has gone on to a new level of spirituality, or perhaps they're being reborn into a better situation in terms of kind of like karma and reincarnation and whatnot. But in the United States, we generally kind of view death as the end point of our life. And so when we lose someone, we view it as kind of this great loss that needs to be kind of mourned over. So the systematic study of death and dying is referred to as thanatology. And of particular interest to thanatologists is the concept of dying with dignity. Dr. Jack Kevorkian was a staunch advocate of this concept of dying with dignity, and he was an advocate of physician-assisted suicide, or the voluntary or physician-assisted use of lethal medication provided by a medical doctor to end someone's life. Oregon was the first state to pass a law allowing physician-assisted suicide in 1997 with the Death with Dignity Act. Since then, Montana, Colorado, Washington, and California have passed similar laws. Now, I'd really like for you all to watch, I think it's about a 12-minute interview with Jack Kevorkian here. He has since passed away, but this interview was back in 1996. And Kevorkian was actually arrested a number of times for breaking the law. He was, again, a staunch believer in the right to die with dignity, to choose to end your own life in old age, and have a physician assist you with doing it so that you didn't end up doing it, say, with a firearm. Now, Kevorkian wasn't just saying that old people should be put to death. He felt that it should only be done in very specific situations. If someone has terminal cancer and every day of their life is just constant pain and suffering and tears, these were the kinds of people that Kevorkian performed kind of this service of physician-assisted suicide for. But it was very controversial when he was alive and still controversial today. Of course, if you're, of a Christian faith, and you abide by the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill being one of them, of course, most people of that kind of faith and belief would not agree with physician-assisted suicide, no matter what the argument made by the doctor is, because it kind of just goes against the entire moral fiber of those religious beliefs. But others, even Christians who have maybe experienced or had someone in their family who kind of got to this point in life where they were just being kept alive by a respirator in the hospital for months, might kind of come to understand that if it's the elderly person's choice, and this is what they want to do to end their life, then some people become more accepting of it. But the interview here kind of goes over kind of his beliefs, how he got started, his being arrested, his thoughts on kind of being an outlaw, so to speak, and continuing to perform physician-assisted suicides even before a lot of these laws were passed in 1997. And if we look at kind of the growth of the hospice industry, hospice is kind of an indicator of our society's changing view of death. So hospice is where terminally ill individuals that used to be brought to a health institution, such as a hospital, now older people who are terminally ill are brought to hospice. And the purpose of hospice is not to cure you or make you better, but the primary purpose is to just comfortably house someone, keep them as comfortable and as happy as possible until they pass. Today, the trend is more toward at-home hospice care, where people can pass out of this life in comfort in their home with their loved ones around them, along with care from medical professionals with special training in the care of dying. Now, in 1969, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross wrote the book On Death and Dying, and she came up with kind of these 5 stages of grief that people go through. In her book, she observed people who were facing death, and she found that there were kind of these common threads in their experiences, and she claimed that during the process of dying, elder adults go through the 5 stages of grief. I'm sure you all have heard these before somewhere in television or movies or reading. So she claimed they go through these 5 stages. First is denial, this kind of I feel fine, this isn't happening to me kind of mindset. The second stage they move into is anger, kind of becoming angry at the fact that their loss of life is perceived as too soon or unjust or unfair, or that they weren't able to kind of yet accomplish what they wanted to. Their life is being kind of cut short, and so they get angry. But once they get through that anger stage, they move into the bargaining stage, which is when elderly people might start to negotiate with a higher power to postpone the inevitable by trying to reform or change the way they live. So they might start praying to God, saying, God, if I go on a 30-minute walk each day, will you keep me alive another 5 years, for one example. And once they get through the bargaining stage, they might go through a period of depression when the individual, the elderly person, begins to resign from life and wallow in hopelessness. But hopefully they get through that stage of depression quickly and come out to the fifth stage, which is acceptance. And this is when the person adjusts to the idea of death, begins to face their death honestly, and tries to make the most of their remaining time on earth with their loved ones. Now, on the next several slides, we're going to go over a few different issues when it comes to sociology and aging, different challenges that face the elderly as they grow old. So on this slide, we're going to focus on poverty and the aging population. So in 1960, about 35% of the elderly population lived on poverty level incomes. That's a huge proportion of the elderly population. That was 1960. Things have gotten better, a lot due to Social Security and Medicaid. And so by 2008, the poverty rate is about 10%, 9.7% for the elderly, and it's still around that level. Although during the economic recession in 2008, the poverty rate for the elderly rose to about 14% for a while. During that recession, a lot of retirement accounts lost about 18% of their value. So there was a lot less money coming in that this elderly population had counted on coming in to help them kind of maintain their lifestyles and continue to be able to pay their rent and any medical bills they might still have, even with Medicaid. And purchase themselves enough food to sustain their lives. So what changed to reduce the poverty level from 1960's 35% poverty rate for the elderly? For one, women were entering the workforce around this time, and much more over the next 40, 50 years. Thus, elderly couples have been bringing in 2 incomes throughout their married lives instead of just 1 income for the husband. Thus, that leads to more savings that can be built up to retire comfortably together. Another factor are better, more comprehensive retirement programs, as well as access to better health care. In addition, there's also been a lot more of a social trend encouraging more healthy lifestyles for older adults, emphasizing staying active through regular exercise and paying a lot of attention to healthy nutrition. Now, the second challenge we'll talk about is a form of discrimination, and it's referred to as ageism. So in early societies, the elderly were respected and revered and the elderly were cared for by their extended family and grown children. The term gerontocracy refers to a type of social structure wherein the most power is held by the society's oldest members. In modern society, though, industrialization led to kind of a diminishment of the social standing of the elderly, since they were viewed as being less productive for the capitalist workforce as they grew older. Wealth, power, and prestige are associated with younger age brackets in our society. Rapid advancements in technology and media have required new skill sets that disadvantage the elderly as well. And this change from kind of the agrarian, rural society to the industrial urban society meant that people no longer worked inside the home or on the family farm. And the elderly don't have the strength and stamina, a lot of them, to continue working outside the home, and thus begin to be seen as or interpreted as a burden through this kind of modern cultural lens. So this term ageism refers to kind of institutional societal discrimination based on age. And ageism exists in all cultures, though to different degrees. Ageist attitudes and biases based on stereotypes often reduce elderly to inferior or limited positions. And this can make older people fear losing their job, feel dismissed by their doctors, or they may feel a lack of power and control over their daily lives. And then the third challenge that we're going to focus on that faces the elderly is mistreatment and abuse. So obviously the frailty that comes with old age renders the elderly dependent on other people for care. Unfortunately, this dependency on others can sometimes result in what is referred to as elder abuse, or when a caretaker intentionally deprives an older person of care or harms the person in his or her charge. Caregivers may be family, friends, health professionals, or employees of senior housing or nursing care. And there's 5 major categories of elder abuse that sociologists focus on. The first is physical abuse, like hitting or shaking. The second is sexual abuse, such as rape or coerced nudity. The third is psychological abuse, like verbal harassment or humiliation. The fourth is neglect or a failure to provide adequate care. So an elderly person might not be bathed frequently enough, or their teeth might not be brushed very often by their caretaker. So kind of this poor hygiene, dehydration, they might not be getting enough water, liquids into their body, or soiled bedding. So they might make a mistake in bed, and their caretaker might neglect to clean them and take care of the mess for quite a while, leaving the elderly person just sitting in their own excrement, essentially. And the fifth type is financial abuse or exploitation. So for instance, people in a family might make changes to the elderly person's living will, or they could add additional names to their bank accounts or bank cards and kind of steal their hard-earned money that they have made over the course of their life. So 1 in 9 Americans over 60 years old have experienced elder abuse. In 2010, over 5.9 million cases of elderly abuse were reported. However, much like child abuse, elder abuse is underreported, so much so that 1 out of every 23 cases of elder abuse is reported. So this number, all of these statistics really are very conservative figures. The rates of elder abuse are probably much more prevalent because a lot of elderly don't know who to report to, may not even have kind of the mental facilities to report abuse. So a few factors that increase the likelihood of elder abuse according to sociological kind of correlations are inexperience, having other demands such as another job, having to care for children, living full-time with the dependent elder, and experiencing a high stress, isolation, and a lack of support. A history of depression in a caregiver also increases the likelihood of elder abuse. And neglect is more likely when care is provided by paid caregivers. Less likely when it's your family members taking care of you. And elder abuse is more likely to happen when the person has low job satisfaction, feels burnt out or underpaid, and these people are more likely to treat the elderly like children. Now, for the conclusion of this lecture, we're going to go over several different sociological, kind of theoretical perspectives on this aging process. And we will start, as usual, with the structural functionalist paradigm, which brings us 3 different perspectives on aging. So here we have disengagement theory, which interprets withdrawing from society and social relationships as a natural part of growing old. In other words, everyone expects to die one day, and because we experience physical and mental decline as we age, it is natural to withdraw from individuals and society. The second functionalist theory is activity theory. And this one claims that activity levels and social involvement are key to the process of aging and key to happiness in old age. So activity theory would interpret happiness of the elderly population coming about because they still feel that they are active in society and are contributing to society, even if it's in a different way than they might have been used to for much of their lives. So participation in activities or hobbies or clubs or church activities and volunteering greatly affect the life satisfaction in our later years. And then the third little sub-theory under functionalism is continuity theory. This one interprets aging in the elderly and says that the elderly have to attempt to maintain social equilibrium and stability by making future decisions on the basis of already developed social rules. So the elderly make specific choices to maintain consistency in internal, like their personality and beliefs, and external structures like relationships, and remain active and involved in later years. Now on this slide, we're going to review kind of the conflict theory perspective on aging. And there's 3 different sub-theories here as well. So first we have modernization theory, which says the primary cause of the elderly losing power and influence in society are the parallel forces of industrialization and modernization. The status of the elderly is devalued and they are increasingly relegated to social exclusion. So the nuclear family, with kind of capitalism and industrialization, has replaced the extended family as the norm. And societies have become increasingly individualistic, and thus the norms for concerning elder care have changed. The second sub-theory under conflict perspective is exchange theory, which says that we experience more dependence as we age, and thus we have to submit to the will of others when we grow into this old age stage of life. Here, relationships are based on mutual exchange. As people age, they have less on hand which they can exchange, and thus their social circles and influence diminish. In this model, the only way to avoid being, quote, discarded by society is to engage in exchange with others. For example, maintaining a large inheritance or helping your grown children with caring for their young children. In other words, making yourself useful. And then the third sub-theory under conflict perspective is age stratification theory, which says members of society are stratified by age just as they're stratified by race, gender, and class. So age comes to serve as this basis of social control and differentiation in a hierarchy, of course. So different age groups will have different access to social resources like political and economic power based on these kind of social understandings of different age stages. And behavioral age norms dictate what members of age cohorts may or may not do. In other words, you have to act your age. And lastly, we'll review the sub-theories that come from the symbolic interactionist paradigm. So there's 3 sub-theories here as well. First is the subculture of aging theory. This focuses on the shared community created by the elderly when they're excluded from participation in other groups. So elders will disengage from society, but they'll develop new patterns of interaction with new peers who share common backgrounds and interests. Elders may find a strong sense of community in their new group. So for instance, when older people move into retirement communities, maybe where they were living before, they were in a big house by themselves, didn't really get out a lot or have a lot of peers or friends. But then when that person moves into kind of a retirement community, they can meet a lot of more people who are experiencing that same life stage that they are, and can make new friends, new boyfriends or girlfriends, and kind of create a new community. The second sub-theory is selective optimization with compensation theory. Basically means the elderly must balance the losses associated with aging with the gains stemming from the same. So aging is a process and not an outcome, and the goals are specific to the individual. Our energy diminishes as we age, and we select personal goals to get the most for the effort we put into our activities, thus making up for the loss of that wider range of goals and activities. And the third is gerotranscendence theory, which says that as people age, they transcend the limited views of life they held in earlier times. The elderly become less self-centered and feel more peaceful, connected to the natural world. They let go of little things, conflict, and start to develop softer views of right and wrong as they prepare to kind of leave their legacy on this earth before they pass. So that's the end of this week's lecture on aging and the elderly. Went over some important vocab terms. We looked at the aging and the graying population of both the United States and the world. Looked a little bit into that baby boomer population that's driving kind of this aging society. And then we looked at all these different stages of the life course, the different biological and social and psychological changes that come about with aging. Looked at aging and sexuality, and of course aging and confronting kind of this final stage of our lives where we go through these 5 stages of grief and start to come to terms with death and dying. And then looked at all those challenges that face the elderly today, particularly poverty, ageism, and mistreatment and abuse. And then did a little broad overview of those different theoretical perspectives on aging, derived from the structural functional perspective, the conflict perspective, and the symbolic interactionist perspective. So that's the end of this lecture, and hope y'all will, if you haven't already, go watch the videos that are linked to. You can find them on Blackboard as well as in the PowerPoint. And I hope y'all have a great week. And email me at kadams@columbustech.edu if you have any questions about the lecture or the Chapter 13 quiz. Have a great week. Bye, guys.